I also realize that once in a while I kind of forget to introduce myself, because I know most of you know me, but for those of you that don't, my name is Mike. So hello, if you are new to class, I teach social studies, and normally I teach, well, it is normal anymore, but when we are in the classroom, I usually teach social studies and a second math class along with Sean's math class. But since we've been working from home, I've been doing the social studies and the science. So you'll see me in both of those classes until we get back in person. But anyway, I just wanted to say a quick hello for those of you that don't know who I am, so that you were wondering, if you were wondering what stranger is boring you to death with social studies, that would be me. All right, so with that said, let's jump into some of these practice questions. I'm going to kind of skip around, and we'll just kind of see how many we get through. And again, if you been to all the classes, great, but don't worry if you haven't been to any classes, it still should be beneficial. So let's go ahead and look at number 3. All right, hopefully everyone can see that clearly. It says, in the late 1700s, Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, who was our nation's second president, wrote the following in a letter to her sister. I will never consent to have our sex considered in an inferior point of light, that each planet shine in their own orbit. If man is Lord, woman is Lordess, that is what I contend for. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Based on the letter, which of the following principles was Abigail Adams advocating? A, the separation of church and state. See anything in there about government versus religion? B, the abolition of slavery. Same thing, I don't see any mention of race or slavery mentioned at all. C, the promotion of scientific learning. Or D, equal rights and opportunities for women. I think the right answer here stands out pretty clearly. Correct answer would be D, equal rights and opportunities for women. That one's pretty straightforward, not very complicated, and like I said, once in a while you'll get questions like that, but more often than not on the test, you're not going to get a lot of questions that straightforward. When you do, be grateful for it. All right, so here is a question I know we did last week, but I want to, I'm not going to do number 5, but I want to do number 4 again, just because it's a good geography quiz and review for those of you that either weren't in class when we did this, and even if you were, making sure you remember. So here's a map of the Union and the Confederacy, so the United States at the time of the Civil War. Okay, and the reason I feel like doing this question is because it's a good quiz to see if we know our state abbreviations. So it says, list 4 states that permitted slavery but did not join the Confederacy. So I can look and see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I believe there are 5 total states. They only ask you to list 4 of them. So go ahead and see if you can figure this out real quickly. And then I'm going to walk us through it here in a second. So the first thing would be to look to the key, right? So if we want to find states that allowed slavery but did not join the Confederacy. So we've got to read the key and figure out what all these colors mean, or all these shades of gray, right? Battle sites, U.S. capitals, Confederate capitals, that's not, that doesn't pertain to this particular question, so let's move through that. So we have free states and territories in the kind of darker gray, okay? We have slave states loyal to the Union in light gray. We have Confederate States of America in white. We have territories supporting Confederacy in the dark gray. And we have the split loyalty, which is represented by the Indiana Territory, or not Indian Territory. Okay, which would become Oklahoma. So if we're looking for states that allowed slavery but did not join the Confederacy, we're looking for which of these colors? Free states and territories, slave states loyal to the Union, Confederate states, territories supporting Confederacy. Well, if the Confederacy is the white, then we want to know what slave states are that were loyal to the Union. In other words, states that allowed slavery but that stayed as part of the United States. So we've got M-O-K-Y, W-V, M-D, and D-E. D-E-L kind of gives it away. That's not an official abbreviation, neither is W-V-A, but so those ones are a little bit easier. So M-O stands for Missouri, K-Y stands for Kentucky, W-V is West Virginia, M-D is Maryland, and D-E is Delaware. So you could list 4 of those 5. And so this would only be tricky on a test if you didn't know what those abbreviations were. Because it doesn't say to list the abbreviations, it says to list the states. So just a quick quiz in whether or not you know some of these abbreviations. All right, so let's keep moving on. Let's do number 6. So number 6 talks about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued in 1863. The proclamation from Abraham Lincoln freed all people enslaved in the states that had seceded from the Union. Secede means to leave. So the states that left the United States become the Confederacy. So in 1863, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all enslaved people in the states that had seceded from the Union. This proclamation was explicitly not to be put into effect in slave states that had remained in the Union. The proclamation went on to say, I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts. Okay, so that's kind of hard to parse or figure out kind of what he's talking about because that's just not the way people talk, right? So that's one of the challenges. So let's look at what the question asks. Okay? The question asks, based on the information given, which of the following was a major reason Lincoln issued the proclamation? So of these 4 things, based on what we are given, right, based on the paragraph and based on the little short quote from the proclamation, what can we tell is one major reason why Lincoln issued the order? Okay? A, to encourage states to secede from the Union. B, to punish slaveholders throughout the South. C, to weaken the North by enlisting former slaves in the Confederate Army. Or D, to weaken the South by enlisting former slaves in the Union Army. Okay? So let's see if we can't eliminate a couple obvious wrong answers here. Okay, so the first one I'd maybe get rid of would be C, to weaken the North by enlisting former slaves in the Confederate Army. President Lincoln was president of the United States, which was the Union, which was the North, right? So if we know our Civil War facts just a little bit, we know that the South was the Confederacy and the North was the Union, which remained, the North was the United States. And the southern states left the United States to become their own country for a short period of time, which was the Confederate States of America. Okay? So, if we know that, then it doesn't make sense that he would issue a proclamation to weaken his own country, right? That doesn't make sense. C is definitely wrong, okay? And for that same reasoning, A would also be wrong. If he is the president of the Union of the United States of the North, then he wouldn't want to encourage states to leave the North, okay? He would want to encourage states to stick together, right? Because the more states that leave, the weaker they become. So A doesn't make sense either, right? So if you throw out A and C, and we look at the two left that kind of deal with either punishing the South or weakening the South, let's look at what seems to be the best answer. B, to punish slaveholders throughout the South. Or D, to weaken the South by enlisting former slaves in the Union Army. Okay? So, both could be argued to be right. B is probably something that, even though he doesn't come right out and say it, he does want to punish slaveholders throughout the South. But is that really the main reason? Okay? The main reason, and especially because this paragraph or the quote from the proclamation really talks about what? It talks about telling slaves that they are now free and that they have a place in the Union Army to fight against the Confederacy. That's what this is saying that any slave that wants to can join the Union Army and fight against the Confederacy, right? Which sounds pretty good, to fight against the people that were keeping you as slaves. Right? So the major reason that he issued this order was to hopefully weaken the South by allowing slaves to join the Union Army. So D is the best answer there, okay? All right, just keep kind of moving on through this and see how far we get. For those of you that don't go to a lot of classes, I know most of you, just looking at who's in class today, most of you have been to at least a few classes. You know, typically we don't just do practice questions. So this is just kind of for the review, but starting next week, we will, I think we'll go over economics. I think will be where the kind of the next chunk of material that we go over, and we'll just start that next week, and that'll be a short, that'll probably just be 1 week, 1 week's worth of material. Maybe a little more because we don't have class on Monday. But let's go ahead, and I got sidetracked. Let me just powering through this. So questions 7, 8, and 9 deal with this chart here. So hopefully you can read it okay. The chart is titled Civil Rights Amendments and Laws, and we have the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection of the law to all persons born in the United States. This did not apply to American Indians. So that was 1868. It wasn't until 1868 that citizenship and equal protection was granted to everyone born in the United States. 15th Amendment, 1870, granted voting rights to African Americans. These are all post-Civil War. Civil Rights Act of 1875 gave African Americans the right to serve on juries, banned racial segregation in public places. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation by race in public places and racial discrimination in employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited literacy tests for voting and allowed the federal government to register voters. And the last one, Civil Rights Act of 1968, outlawed discrimination in the sale or rental of homes. Okay, so there's those lists of all the different amendments to the Constitution that deal with civil rights. Okay, so equality among all genders and races, and all that stuff, right? So 7 says, an Asian American registers to vote and is given a reading test. Place a dot in the cell from the chart above containing the civil rights amendment or law relevant to this situation. So, person goes to vote, is given a literacy test or a reading test. First of all, is that allowable? Nope. Second of all, what does that pertain to? That pertains to, this one is a pretty straightforward one. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? That prohibited literacy tests for voting. In other words, you don't have to read to be able to vote. Okay? That is a constitutional amendment And that dates back to years of, discrimination against slaves, because slaves, even though once they were free, were given the right to vote, there was a long period of time where you where states were allowed to give literacy tests before they allowed you to vote. And what do you think most slaves? Do you think most slaves could read? No, because they weren't taught how to read, right? Or allowed to read. So that was changed in 1965. In the scope of history, not very long. Pretty amazing. Okay, let's look at number 8. Which statement best summarizes what this chart shows about voting rights? Which statement best summarizes what the chart shows about voting? So again, we're just talking about voting. A, African Americans were granted the vote 5 years after the Civil War ended. B, African Americans were granted the vote 100 years after the Civil War ended. C, African Americans were granted the vote soon after the Civil War, but laws enforcing these rights had to be passed a century later. Or D, African Americans were granted the vote in 1870, but American Indians were never granted these same rights. Okay? So if we spend a little time kind of ruling out some of these obvious ones, right, we can probably figure out the best answer choice here. A, African Americans were granted the vote 5 years after the Civil War ended. Okay. Even if we don't know exactly when the Civil War was, we can look and see 1870, that was when they were granted the right to vote, and the 1860s was when the Civil War took place. So A sounds logical, sounds correct even, but does it best summarize everything shown in this? It doesn't. It's too specific. Okay? B, African Americans were granted the vote 100 years after the Civil War. We know that's not true because we just saw that voting rights were granted in 1870. So B is false. C says African Americans were granted the vote soon after the Civil War, but laws enforcing these rights had to be passed a century later. That sounds pretty good. And D, African Americans were granted the vote in 1870, but American Indians were never granted these same rights. So the thing that stands out in D, there's nothing here that shows us that this second part is true. American Indians were never granted these same rights. That's not something that this shows. Okay? And it's not true. But regardless, right? So the best answer is C. And whenever you're asking to summarize something, it's always best to look out for the answer choice that is the most general or the least specific, right? Because these others have very specific things mentioned in them. And typically, if you're asked to summarize something, you're not going to do that with a very specific statement, right? So the fact that this one is a little more general and a little more all-encompassing should kind of stand out and kind of send an alarm off that if I'm looking for a summary of something, chances are it's not going to be these other ones that are very specific. All right, and then last question about this chart, number 9 says, how are the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 similar? Well, let's look real fast. Civil Rights 1875 gave African Americans the right to serve on juries, banned racial segregation. 1964 outlawed segregation by race in public places, racial discrimination. Now let's look at our choices. A, they both guaranteed African Americans citizenship rights. B, they both prohibited the legal separation of people by race places. C, they both ensured that African Americans could serve on juries. D, they both make job discrimination illegal. So those are all 4 very specific things. If you look and read, there is literally only one thing that is mentioned in both places. Okay? Citizenship rights is not mentioned in either. Citizenship rights is up here, so A is wrong. B, they both prohibited the legal separation of people by race in public places. banned racial segregation in public places, outlawed segregation by race in public places. Boom. There's your answer, right? Again, the other two, serving on juries is only mentioned here, not mentioned here. They both make job discrimination illegal, is only mentioned here, not here. So the only one mentioned in both places is B. There you go. All right. So let's do at least a few more, and if we end up finishing up a little bit early, then we'll just call it a few minutes. I don't want to overburden you with questions. Let's do number 10. And again, some of these are topics we talked about directly in the last couple of weeks, and some aren't. And that's going to be the case when you take the test. There's going to be questions that talk about things we didn't talk about. And that's okay, right? Don't panic and think, oh, we didn't talk about this. How am I going to figure this out? Just trust that you have all the information you need, because you do. You don't need to have an overwhelming knowledge of social studies to pass the test. What you need to do is be a good, efficient reader, and you need to be able to, be a good test taker. That's really what it comes down to with the social studies and the science test, for that matter. All right, so number 10 talks about Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in the spring of 1876. In the fall, he exhibited it at an exposition in Philadelphia. When leading scientists saw Bell's invention, they said, "Here is the greatest marvel ever achieved in electrical science." Which of the following statements related to the passage is an opinion, not a fact? Okay? Straightforward. We're just looking for which one of these is opinion, not fact. A, Bell invented the telephone in 1876. Is that someone's opinion, or is that factual? Can we look and see definitively if that happened? Tells us right there, it did. So A is fact. B, Bell exhibited the telephone at an exposition in Philadelphia. Is that an opinion or a fact? Can that be debated? No, it's declarative, right? He did do that, we know. So B is fact. C, scientists admired Bell's invention. Okay, now there's something that sounds like a little more of an opinion, right? Let's look at D first. The telephone was the greatest electrical invention ever. Okay, also sounds like an opinion. So, which one's right? Scientists admired Bell's invention, or D, the telephone was the greatest electrical invention ever. The key to the answer lies in the way things are worded, right? They both are correct, technically, right? But one answers the question better than the other. In other words, let me see what I'm getting at. It is possible, and it's likely, that there were scientists out there that didn't admire Bell's invention. But generally speaking, right, this is more general, and this is more declarative in terms of the telephone was the greatest electrical invention ever. Most people wouldn't dispute C. Most people wouldn't say, oh, there were lots of scientists that didn't admire his invention, right? But D, the telephone was the greatest electrical invention ever, is very much like something people would debate, right? Not that people don't admire it, but saying something is the greatest ever is a red flag to me that that's an opinion, right? Because how many people agree on the greatest thing ever in any aspect of life? Not many, right? So D is the best answer there. So there's an example of a question where you've got two pretty viable options. You really have to look at the way things are worded, and the one that really stands out is answering the question the best. All I can say. All right, let's do one more question, and then we will call it a day. Let me see. For the sake of time, we won't do the Watergate questions. Let's do questions 14 and 15. I said one more, but they're going to link together. And those that are left standing. So number 14 says in 1990, approximately how many people of Cuban nationality lived in the United States? How many people? So find Cuban. Cuban is here, right? Hispanic population by nationality in 1990. So we got to look over here, and it lines up pretty closely to 1. But we also have to make sure we read over here. This says what? Population in millions. Okay? So the answer isn't 1. The answer is 1 million. So A, B, C, or D. And if we know our math and our numbers, we know 1 million is that number right there. C is your right answer. So let's look at number 15. A Hispanic family moved into an apartment next door to yours in 1990. Based solely on the bar graph, which place was the family most likely to be from? It's kind of silly, right? This is just based on this graph. In 1990, where did most Hispanic families come from? From Mexico. There's your answer. Not an overly difficult question. So tomorrow I will pick out some new questions to review on U.S. history. We'll probably look at my old paper version GED tests that I have and do some questions from that, and then field any questions from you all about anything U.S. history related you want to go over or need some more clarity on, and then we'll just move on and keep things going. So that's all I've got for social studies for the day. So I will see everybody tomorrow morning at 11:15 for more social studies. And until then, good one.